Top of the morning to you and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Russian Aviation Agency says Wagner boss was on crashed plane. Officials released names of crew who died. Ukraine's show mixed reactions to Prigozhin-linked plane crashes. Muscovites say it was to be expected. Plus, jailed Russian general linked to Putin's palace dies suddenly. Thank you for joining us. We begin with news coming out of the Russian emergency services, who've announced that the bodies of all 10 people on the Embraer Legacy jet have now been recovered. According to the authorities, those on board include Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin and his second-in-command Dmitry Utkin, the man who gave the mercenary group its name. Attention is now focused on what caused the crash. Police have sealed off the area around the crash site, and the Russian Aviation Authority has formed a special commission to look into it. Several pieces of an aircraft that crashed in Russia's Tver region were seen at first light today. Footage shows at least 3 body bags being stretchered away from one of the sites of the plane crash, which is thought to have killed all 10 people on board, 7 passengers and 3 crew members. The plane crashed near the village of Kushnekino and was on its way from Moscow to St. Petersburg. There was no official comment from the Kremlin or the Defense Ministry on the fate of Prigozhin, head of the Wagner mercenary group and a self-declared enemy of the army leadership, over what he argued at the time was its incompetence and its prosecution of Russia's special military operation, as they called it, in Ukraine. A Telegram channel linked to Wagner Grey Zone pronounced him dead, however, and hailed him as a hero and a patriot who, it said, had died at the hands of unidentified people it called the traitors to Russia. Staying with this development, Russia's Federal Air Transport Agency has now released the names of the 10 people on board the Legacy 600 jet. They included 2 pilots, 1 flight attendant, and 7 other passengers in the private jet when it crashed, reportedly killing all on board. Citing the airplane, the agency gave the names of the lost crew as Captain Alexei Levshkin, co-pilot Rostam Karimov, flight attendant Kristina Raspopova. Now, the Federal Air Transport Agency shared the names of the passengers it said were on board as well. They were named Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin, Sergei Propushtin, Evgeny Makarian, Alexander Tutman, Valery Chekalov, a senior aide to Prigozhin designated by the U.S. Treasury for acting for or on behalf of Prigozhin and was facilitating shipments of munitions to the Russian Federation. Dmitry Utkin, a trusted lieutenant of Prigozhin since the beginning of the war, and also Nikolai Matusyev. As expected, reactions have been coming in following the news of the Russian mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin reportedly killed in that plane crash. The news divided opinion on the streets of the Russian capital Moscow, with some describing it as a tragedy. Others are moved by the reports. Many Russians were also not surprised when the news of Prigozhin's reported death broke yesterday. On the other hand, Kyiv residents have mixed reactions. While some were full of joy, like 83-year-old pensioner Polina Kazashkova, others believe the plane crash meant Russia's government will tighten its grip on power. Prigozhin spearheaded a mutiny against Russia's top army brass on June the 23rd to the 24th, which President Vladimir Putin said could have tipped Russia into civil war. The Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin led a failed mutiny against Vladimir Putin in June. Now, it's one thing being on the passenger list. It remains to be confirmed if the Wagner chief had actually boarded the flight. U.S. National Security spokesperson Adrienne Watson confirmed that U.S. officials have seen the reports of the Russian jet crash. Now, Ms. Watson said, "We have seen the reports. If confirmed, no one should be surprised." Similarly, U.S. President Joe Biden says he was not surprised at news that Prigozhin may have died in a plane crash in Russia. Presidential aide to the Ukrainian president wrote on social media, the crash of the plane was a signal from the Kremlin to anyone who showed disloyalty. Estonia Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, on the other hand, said Putin will eliminate opponents, and that scares anyone who's thinking of expressing an opinion different from his. For Polish Foreign Minister, those who threaten Putin's power do not die naturally. Now let's take a listen to some more reactions, this time from an analyst who speculates on the factors that could have led to this incident, as well as what it could potentially mean for President Putin's message to other challengers.
Would Putin have done this? Well, he has certainly the Russian security forces have a history of poisoning people at home and abroad, and political opponents or people that Mr. Putin has previously called traitors. And he has, of course, called Prigozhin, well, he's called some of them traitors. But, you know, why did it take so long? Your original question. Yeah, this is interesting. In a way, it took a long time. In a way, it was quick. I think the answer to that is why didn't it happen in July? Is that and you know, the General Surovikin's dismissal or disappearance and dismissal yesterday. Well, I think there is some division in the military on how the war has gone, and so likely Prigozhin had some sympathizers in the Russian military, as does Surovikin. And so making sure that those people have been demoted or removed, and this has happened actually with some members of the Russian military a little lower down over the last month or so. So I think that's probably why it has, and also making sure they know where the bulk of Wagner forces are. Wagner was asked after that rebellion to turn in its equipment. So presumably that's now been done. The bulk of the forces have arrived in Belarus. So I think it took a little bit of time to get all of those ducks in a row. And so in that sense, this timing, you know, is probably the earliest such a thing could have happened without causing further trouble or rebellions within the Russian military. Also, he's largely been divested, Prigozhin, of some of his bigger businesses prior to this. So, you know, if we look retrospectively, this timing sort of is almost the earliest it could have been done in terms of getting all of those ducks in a row.
Now let's talk to Mr. Denis Riva, researcher, Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, South Africa, from where he joins us. A very good morning to you, and thank you for making out the time to be with us today.
Good morning.
This hit me like a bolt out of the blue, Prigozhin's reported death alongside others on that plane. Why is everyone saying that they're not surprised that that happened? Well, obviously, it's stating the obvious. However, shouldn't benefit of the doubt be given and investigations be conducted before people jump the gun and jump to conclusions? We know that it feeds into the narrative that President Putin is someone who gets rid of his opponents in the most suspicious, or that people who oppose President Putin perish in very suspicious circumstances. But in this case, wouldn't it have been too obvious? Prigozhin was just day before yesterday purportedly in Africa talking about how Wagner has a resurgence and they were ready to help free the nations who were being oppressed by the oppressors.
Well, I wouldn't say it's very surprising at all, actually. The manner in which it happened isn't surprising. It would have been surprising or mysterious if Prigozhin disappeared in Africa, for instance, or if he felt unwell, because we know he also had some medical issues. But the manner in which the murder of Prigozhin and the rest of the crew happened is not very mysterious at all. We've seen the debris preliminary. Of course, an investigation needs to happen, but from the damage that we can see on these pictures, it appears that the damage had been done by an air defense missile. So it's very typical to similar incidents when an air defense missile is being used. The plane was shot in Russian airspace. It's not that unexpected at all. Besides, to answer your question, we've seen other instances where prominent critics of Putin have been murdered. And every time, of course, the question is, would it benefit Putin? But if it happens once, you may have a benefit of the doubt. When it happens so many times, you kind of see the pattern here. One of the prominent Russian President Putin's critics, Nemtsov, was shot near Kremlin in 2014, I believe. Of course, Navalny, another critic, was poisoned with a very specific nerve agent a few years ago, and in every instance, it was very explicit the way that the attempts were made. So it's not that unexpected at all, to be honest. Of course, the timing is interesting. It happened a few months after the mutiny. Some people question why did it take so long for Putin to act? But I agree with some of the arguments that were laid before, that Putin and Russia needed to get everything in place, needed to make sure that the damage from Prigozhin's death is minimized, that they don't get another mutiny on their hands. And I believe now is a good time. So it's not as surprising at all, actually.
You see my point? You're already calling it the murder of Prigozhin. Let's lay the facts on the table as we know them. Prior to the uprising, the rebellion, the mutiny, as it was called, Prigozhin didn't have any problem with Vladimir Putin. It was Vladimir Putin that put food on Prigozhin's table. It was Vladimir Putin that helped him become the billionaire that he was. It was Vladimir Putin that helped his ascendancy to the point that he was running Wagner, as they said that he was. What was happening before the mutiny was him criticizing, and he never, I think, criticized, and you can confirm this for me if you will, President Putin directly. He criticized the commanders. He never attacked President Putin directly. And after the uprising, he kept talking about how loyal he was to President Putin, even though during the mutiny, there was some talk of a coup, which he debunked as well. So are you saying that rebellion from Wagner was the reason, and this is just conjecture, we don't have any facts. This is, as you're saying, we look at the pattern of deaths of those who opposed President Putin, but in this case, will it actually serve President Putin's purpose to have Prigozhin offed in this manner so soon after the mutiny? It's, yes, about a month, not so long, but the mutiny is still fresh in people's minds. And the first person to whom the finger will be pointed is Putin himself. So is he really that sort of person that will take that kind of action? Is President Putin, does he consider Prigozhin such a threat that he'll have him killed in this manner?
I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. A short answer to your question would be yes, he is that man. You're absolutely right to point out that Prigozhin has been very careful about the way he frames his actions. It was never about Putin or in opposition to Putin. It was always about the war efforts, and the military leadership in Russia. At the same time, while he didn't have a problem with Putin, there was a long-standing feud with the Minister of Defense, the Russian Minister of Defense, Shoigu, that has been going on for the past at least 3 or 4 years since the Wagner's involvement in Syria. And it seems that by June this year, Prigozhin has lost the struggle against the Minister of Defense, which is when we heard the news that Wagner Group is to be is to be integrated into the structure of the Russian military, which also led to the coup, to the uprising and over the last months or so. In that regard, I think while it wasn't directed at Putin, the mutiny attempt was a very personal thing for Putin, because it questioned Putin's rule. In a way, it threatened his rule. It exposed some of the challenges within Russia, and then it became personal for Putin. And Putin is many things, but one thing he is not is forgiving, especially when it comes to people who have offended him personally or have betrayed him. Putin many times have said it publicly that one thing he will never forgive is a betrayal. And by crossing this line, by staging the mutiny, Prigozhin took the conflict that he had with the Ministry of Defense and made it and expanded it to the point that it affected Putin and his rule and his authority and legitimacy. So in that regard, I think what we're seeing is a very clear signal to anyone in Russia who may be thinking of doing something similar or questioning Putin's rule or overstepping the line, that they will be dealt with no matter who they are. And it's very important for Putin to send this signal that his authority and his rule cannot be questioned, even if Prigozhin didn't go to Moscow in the end, even if the mutiny was recalled. It's still a very important point for Putin to make, that his rule is absolute and it should not be questioned.
And if this is true, this is totally mafia-style, Godfather, Goodfellas, Mario Puzo-esque actions by the Russian president, if it is indeed so that this occurred on President Putin's orders. But it'll be remiss of me, before I let you go, which we want to now for purposes of time, without you telling us how your assessment of the Brics meeting in South Africa. We know that President Putin used that opportunity to say that the war between Russia and Ukraine was as a result of Ukraine and its allies forcing his hand, that he never really wanted to get into the war. He wants the war to stop, but that he had to do this because he was forced to do so. It's the elephant in the room. We know it's a business summit, but he had to talk about it. That was the elephant in the room. He had to address it, and he didn't take responsibility. He pushed it to the West.
Yeah, this is not a new narrative. I believe Russia uses every opportunity it gets, every international meeting. The narrative is more or less the same, that Russia is not to be blamed for this war, that the West and Ukraine are to be blamed, and that Russia is a peaceful nation. They're ready to negotiate. It's just that the West and Ukraine are so warmongering, and they don't want peace. So this was to be expected. It would be strange, in fact, if Russia didn't use this opportunity to repeat this narrative. The extent to which the message was heard or received is hard to judge. Again, this is not a new narrative necessarily. So in that case, I think most states have already developed their sort of position on war in Ukraine, and I don't think his address drastically changed that. But overall, I think the Brics Business Forum went as it was expected. We heard some news about potential expansion of the membership, including new countries. The list: Argentina, Iran, UAE, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. So the BRICS summit, I think, despite some of the hiccups, can be said to be successful.
Still very surreal to me that Prigozhin is reportedly dead, but now the BRICS summit is what we are paying attention to, and will continue to do so. Thank you so much, Mr. Dinas Riva, who joined us from Pretoria in South Africa, a researcher of the Institute for Security Studies.
Thank you for having me.
After the break, President Putin tells Brics that Russia wants to end war, which was, according to him, unleashed by the West. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. to the sophomore stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. While the Prigozhin plane crash was causing a stir, Russia's President Vladimir Putin was taking part in anniversary events for the Battle of Kursk. He made a speech about the battle in which up to 500,000 Soviet soldiers fell in the summer of 1943. He also joined in honoring the fallen soldiers with a minute's silence.
На стрелках и саперах, разведчиках и связистах, на экипажах танков и боевых машин, на артиллеристах.
An imprisoned former general with Russia's security services who reportedly had knowledge of the construction of President Vladimir Putin's Black Sea residence has died in custody. This was reported by the state news agency RIA Novosti. General Gennady Lopriev, who was convicted of bribery offenses in 2017 and was serving more than 9 years at a correctional colony in the central Ryazan region, suddenly fell ill and was sent to a local hospital where he died on August the 16th, according to the reports. According to the state news agency, he was convicted of taking bribes in the total amount of about 7 million rubles. He was also convicted of illegal possession of pistols and ammunition. Although those convictions were overturned on appeal, the general had always maintained his innocence of all charges. Russia has appointed a new acting head of its aerospace forces to replace Sergei Surovikin, nicknamed General Armageddon, who vanished from view after the Wagner mercenary mutiny against the top brass. During the June 23-24 revolt, Surovikin, who once commanded Russia's overall military effort in Ukraine, appeared in a video looking strained and without his insignia, urging Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin to abandon his march on Moscow. Since the mutiny, which was ended by negotiations and a deal, some Russian and foreign news outlets have said that Surovikin, who was often publicly commended by Prigozhin in the run-up to the revolt, was being investigated for possible complicity and being held under house arrest. His reported removal suggests the authorities found fault with his behavior, but the details of his alleged wrongdoing remain unknown. Russian news outlet, two of which, RBC and Riba, a telegram channel close to the Ministry of Defense, reported that Surovikin had been removed from his position as the head of the Russia Air Force. Avzalov was previously Deputy Surovikin and has been Chief of Staff of the Aerospace Forces for at least 4 years. Now, joining us is Mr. Olabode Shomi, a member of the African Business Roundtable, co-owner of the Cap Tree Limited, joining us from our Abuja studios in north-central Nigeria. Well, welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
We have to begin with the Prigozhin death. We have to also hear your opinion on the assertions by people that this was because of his betrayal of the Russian cause as a result of the mutiny that occurred, that is Prigozhin. But remember, if he was in that plane and he was killed by the Russians themselves, he wasn't alone in that plane. The flight crew were there, and those who had nothing to do with the Wagner mutiny. Surely if President Putin was going to get rid of Yevgeny Prigozhin, there will be other ways to do it?
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, I would want to think that. But it's also important to put in perspective that this is war. So it's a war situation, and when there are wars, the way the thinking of those who execute battle agendas is that there will be casualties. So you can look at the unintended consequences or the unintended deaths there as casualties to some of these things. But for perspective, I think the greatest impact in terms of the debt, in terms of the war itself, is its impact within the energy sector, the impact within the EU, the impact even for Nigeria and the Arab nations. So yes, it's without proof. It's basically connecting the dots. It's a bit of some conjecture, but it can be implied, it can be inferred, and it can be analyzed to mean that this debt is directly connected to some kind of influence within the Russian hierarchy.
Inference, it's a big one, it's a big allegation, and it's one obviously that continues to feed into the narrative of how people that are opposed to President Putin or show malcontent with him die unexpectedly and in very suspicious ways. But let's go to South Africa now, and let's stay in Johannesburg, where President Putin also had to address the war in Ukraine. But for the business side of things, what did you make of the Brics summit? And what did you make of the attendance of the other nations and Vice President Kashim Shettima of Nigeria, who was representing President Bola Tinubu?
Okay, Brics is an economic agenda. So it's probably the equivalent of the G8 nations, but for less prosperous nations, for want of a better word. And aside, I mean, that's on the surface, but in more specific terms, there is the thinking of developing a currency, and a currency for trade, which will rival the dollar. And if that is to be successful, that will make a significant shift in global order. It is not unexpected that those who have significant influence in the current global order will not want that to happen. And so there's a lot of politics to it, there's a lot of economics to it. So, and that's at the foundation. For us as Nigeria, we're a developing nation, and the position that has been taken thus far, I think, can be said to be logical and in our interest, and basically is a kind of non-aligned position, which means that we are happy to talk with the Chinese, we are also happy to talk with the Americans and the West and all that. And so, which basically means we're following a perspective of enlightened self-interest. So I believe that's very much in order. And one of the things that was the run-up to the summit was basically the celebration of China with, India with Russia celebrating the purchase of crude oil in rupees or something, or what, I mean, a currency other than the US dollar. And were this to become the norm, I mean, that's serious impact in the energy geopolitics.
Is it possible that a common currency can be adopted by by the 5 countries if India, Russia, China, Brazil, South Africa can actually dot the I's, cross the T's, and engage themselves in such a way that there's a common interest and their national interests, though not on the back burner, remain forefront, as well as their collective interest, that they indeed can dislodge the dollar and indeed can have more sway nationally. Already we know, as has been reiterated over and again, that the GDP of these countries exceeds that of the G7. Not by a very great margin, but it does do so. So if they can agree on the finer points of whatever their decisions are, then they can actually begin to give America and the other countries in the global north a run for their money.
I think the fundamental factors that you mentioned, they already exist, in the sense that it is a national interest for these countries to trade in a currency of one of them. It is also economic interest for the same countries to trade in the currency of one of them. The issue will be which one will be most ideal. But equally important is that America has been a global power for over 100 years, and they did not retain that position by being unintelligent and by not knowing what they are doing. So I would not expect them to sit back and allow everything to just go smooth sail. So whoever is behind, or the people, the strategists, the protagonists, so to speak, behind those movements, they need to buckle up. But for us, and this is where we come in, it is important that we engage both sides and get them to be part of our infrastructure development. So there's the talk about the gas infrastructure, the AKK, and as well as this Trans-Saharan gas pipeline, which is on hold now because of Niger. But there's also the Nigeria-Morocco gas pipeline that is existing. So we could possibly get all sides to be interested in our own energy program, and then leading us to be a more prosperous nation. I mean, I believe that should be our thinking and our foreign policy trust.
China was criticized by the United States, warning that the United States has warned countries that China gives money to put it in very simple terms, that they should be wary about doing so. This is prior to this, and that China has its own intentions. China is very generous with helping infrastructure development across many African countries, including South Africa, including Nigeria. Is this something that we should pay attention to? That if we get involved, more involved with business with China, we see how China has been investing in Nigeria. If they're investing that much, what do they actually seek to get back in return? Is there something more sinister that has to do with China's investments in developing countries?
Well, first of all, there is nobody, absolutely nobody, who invests and doesn't have some kind of expectation. I mean, if we were to even look at some of the more fundamental things, I mean, if we were to get closer to God, it's because we are expecting some spiritual blessings. Maybe we want to make heaven or Aljana, somewhere there. Nobody just does things for nothing. So even if the US were to give us this very, very nice advice, it is not because they don't have any interest. They do have certain interest. Yes, China, like anybody else, has an interest in whatever it is that they give. It is incumbent upon the receiver to ensure that their own interest and the interest of the lending nation aligns. And that is where the responsibility comes in. So basically, it's like saying, don't date that lady, she will end up wanting to marry you. I mean, something should lead to something. So I don't think what they are saying, what the US is saying in terms of advice is wrong, but I think it's also logical and it's self-evident. It is incumbent, it is the responsibility of any nation that is engaging another to ensure that they have their best brains look into the deals, look into the contract, and ensure that the best deals are arrived at. I think that's our own responsibility. And China is a part of the world. As long as they are going to remain, as long as they remain the biggest nation in the world, as long as they have the economic might that they have, it is responsible to look at a constructive way to engage them so that you don't fall prey. It's not to avoid them. Avoidance is not the issue. It's to learn how to engage them constructively.
But when one becomes subservient, or you condescend to countries such as China, how is that in national interest? The United States, by the way, are a fine one to talk, because they themselves are being criticized for their foreign policy. They themselves, in their country, have some of their products, some of their components that have links to China that they want to not happen anymore, so they can be more self-sufficient in the United States itself. But developing countries who also need that funding, they need that infrastructure, they need that money, and they don't want to go to the IMF, who are also being criticized for their stringent payback mechanisms. Where do the developing nations turn?
So the developing nations need to think by themselves, because basically, if you speak to the IMF and the World Bank policies, I'm yet to see one nation, whether in Southeast Asia, whether in Southern America, whether in Africa, that has followed IMF policies to the letter and came out of poverty into prosperity. Exactly. If you recall, one of our first connections with the IMF policies was the SAP, Structural Adjustment Program of the 80s. And that led to what we know today as the SAP riots, where because of hardship in society and all that, students had to close universities and all that. And those were fundamental IMF policies. So it doesn't matter what the US says. It doesn't matter what China says. What matters is what we say, what we want, and what we do. So we need to come up with our own homegrown, internally well-thought-out policies on how to engage them. And when we decide that this is how we're going to engage them, and this is what we want to achieve from engaging them, we don't owe anybody any apologies. It is not true, really, that nations condescend to other nations. It is true that people can sell their rights, but as long as you hold you can get your chin off your chest and you hold your head on high, you may be in a position at a disadvantage, but that is not the equivalent of being condescended to. And it is the sum total of interactions, the sum total of how we engage different nations that determine our own self-worth. And it must be understood, maybe this is an opportunity to say this. The London School of Economics did a study so many years ago, and they found out that even for companies, 70% of the value of the brand comes from how the staff of a company perceive the company. In other words, 70% of our value as Nigerians will come from how Nigerians perceive, speak, and interact about Nigeria itself. So our self-worth really does not lie from the outside. It begins from the inside. And like I said, we need to decide what we want. We need to stay true to what is important to us. And based on those things, we need to engage the system, which is the outside world or the international community, I have to say it.
No truer words were said. Thank you so much, Mr. Olabode Showomi, member of the African Business Roundtable, oil and gas expert and co-owner of Captree Limited, who joined us from our studios in Abuja. Many thanks. Let's see how, if at all, this Brics convergence will tip the global economic balance. Thanks so much.
Thank you. The pleasure is all mine.
Coming up, more and congratulations to India. Stay with us. Welcome back to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. We're joined by Yinka Oyeniji, international affairs analyst who's in East Midlands in the UK, who's joining us from that region. It's good to have you this morning. Very good morning to you.
Morning, sir.
I know the first question I'll be asking of you obviously has to do with your impressions of the purported death of Yevgeny Prigozhin. What are your thoughts on this incident?
Well, so many questions, few answers. There are many conjectures as well. And then we can look at the facts and then be able to hazard guesses and try to be ensure that they are safe at this time. So what do we know so far? We know that yesterday morning that two planes were involved in an incident where one of them purportedly being a plane crash, okay? Those two planes are connected to Prigozhin, who is the Wagner founder. 10 bodies, okay, have been retrieved from the wreckage and from one of the planes, but the identities cannot be ascertained at this time. And I don't want to explain the gory details. Gone beyond recognition, some of them decapitated. So as of this time, all we can say is that the manifest reads that the Wagner founder was on one of the planes. However, his second private jet also hovered over that region for a few minutes and then cannot be, its location at this time cannot be ascertained. So the news in the media is that it is very likely that the founder and co-founder of Wagner are both on the doomed flight. That is what we know as of this time. So there are speculations. We can't ascertain the identities of the victims of the crash. They are just speculations at this time that he may have been on one of the flights, specifically the one which crashed, because his name has been confirmed to be on the manifest of that ill-fated flight.
So basically what's happening now, as the United States have also said that if it's to be confirmed, his name is on the manifest, as you said, until it's proven by the remains that he was on board that flight, it's still jumping the gun that he was on the flight. But the incident itself, do you think it was an accident or a deliberate attack?
Oh well, so it's curious. That's the word I'll use. It's curious that since 2015, there have been planes disappearing in the space between Russia and Ukraine. Okay, we've had the plane crash, we've had the plane shot down allegedly mistakenly by Iranian forces. We've had the plane disappeared with all its passengers on board. We still have never been able to find those passengers or the whereabouts of the plane. And then this. So do we call it an accident? At this time, it's too early to call, to make it an accident, or to otherwise think that there are sinister motives behind it. There are reports, confirmed reports from international news agencies that the plane was shot down by Russia air defense systems, okay? And then there's also another report, the latest, being that there was a bomb on board. Now, the accident as it is right now, parts of the plane were found, well, other parts were intact, some were burnt beyond recognition. The latest being that a bomb was on board that plane. So at this time, we could say safely that it wasn't an accident, okay? So it's either it was shot down or there was a bomb on board. So yes, we can conclude that that wasn't an accident.
This obviously has taken a lot of attention away from the conflict, which continues as we speak. And one of the incidents is that in Ismail, a port by the Danube River, 13 tons of grain were destroyed by a Russian attack. They say that that particular silo and that particular manufacturing hub now functions at maybe 15% of its capacity by this deliberate attack on the grain reserves and silos of Ukraine. Is this a strategy after the expiration and the departure of Russia from the Black Sea grain deal to attack the grain and agriculture infrastructure of Ukraine?
It's an interesting conjecture. I never considered it to be a decoy. I never saw it that way. Instead, I think it is now ripe for us to broach the topic in clear terms. Okay, we know for a fact, and I found it interesting, exactly 2 months after the, if you like, the purported coup into Russia, exactly 2 months, it was the same day, June the 26th, between the 23rd and 26th, the Wagner group marched into Russia and we're going to cause a change of government. This same Wagner founder said, Russia is going to have a new president. That's what he said. And then we know what followed. The government in Russia can be unforgiving. We know the spate of deaths, of alleged suicide, even of people dying from bomb explosions right there in Russia. So exactly 2 months precise after that, this happened. So there would be many things to consider to try to form a clear view of what is happening. Could it be a decoy from the latest onslaughts of Russia on Ukraine? I don't think so. It's part of it. In the last 10 days, at least, it's been Ukraine bombing strategic targets of Russia, taking planes out of the sky, and then also launching attacks on ammunition depot of Russia. These are colossal losses on the part of Russia. So the war is still going on, no doubt. But right now, the questions to ask will be, number one, is this Wagner leader trying to fake his own death so that he can go away into exile or something? And we know that as of Monday, his whereabouts were still pinpointed to Africa. And then the plane in question was supposed to be moving from Africa to Russia and then from Belarus like that. That's how he's been making his movements. Is he the one faking his own death, seeing that we cannot identify if he was one on that plane, so that he can go away quietly and then Putin can be off his back as a result of the alleged coup or the coup that never really exactly happened, that wasn't successful? That's one point of looking at it. Number two, is this the government of Russia doing payback? Is it the government saying, you can't cause this mutiny and think that you get away with it? That has happened severally. That is the stock in trade from Russia. So is this payback time? Okay, that's another way to look at it. The third point to see is, could it be forces that really, really want to cause a further divide between the Wagner group and Russia that have done this thing? So it is too early to call to be able to determine whether it's a decoy or it is Putin going after this man, or it is in fact the Wagner chief himself buying himself time to get lost in the world.
Indeed, this will be a hotbed of conspiracy theories and conjecture, sequel to or prequel to the investigations and what they do turn out, and how much disclosure the Russian authorities will be open to sharing with the rest of the world. So that is something that is obviously going to be a gray area. But my question to you at the time, I don't know whether you heard me, was concerning new attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure by Russia and the attacks on grain storage facilities and silos, of which there was one in the Ismail port, that is by the Danube River of the port, where it can now only function at 15% capacity because 13,000 tons of grain were destroyed. Do you think Russia is deliberately targeting Ukraine's storage infrastructure, or these are incidents that happen by the way?
No, I think that goes without saying. I had said it. It wasn't a decoy. It's not to take attention away from what Russia is doing. Immediately, Russia exited the grain deal. It's the fair targets, all the ports. This is not the first. Immediately, within a few hours after exiting that deal, started to attack the ports. In fact, a warning shot was fired at a vessel just last week, okay, on that same channel. So Ukraine has been attacking Russian vessels and been sinking them. The same day, Russia has also been attacking depots. It's not the first. So it will continue. The fight has moved beyond just shelling buildings across both divides. Okay, Russia itself is under attack with its buildings being attacked by drones. Ukraine is suffering attacks at its ports, at its storage houses for grain. So Ukraine attacks Russian vessels. Russia attacks Ukraine depot for storing food. So that is fair game in the war that is going on, and there's no decoy. Russia is not hiding, saying that it's not doing these things. It is attacking. Every means of livelihood for Ukraine is being attacked by Russia at the moment. And we are not questioning the identity of those behind those attacks. They are fair game. It's what is obvious to everybody. The only thing at this time is to note, and we have stated this separately, the war has gone from just on the ground, saying that Ukraine is recording gains on the ground. It moved to the sky. They started to take out planes. They started to use drones. It's moved from there now to grains. Who knows where it will go next?
Well, we do hope that as it continues, that this conflict, well over 550 days now, it's incredible that it continues, and we hope that we begin to see an end in some way, shape, form, or fashion. Thank you so much, Mr. Yinka Oyeniji, who joined us from East Midlands in the UK, for your contributions and insight this morning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Macaulay.
3 U.S. senators who visited Kyiv on Wednesday have pledged more support to the Ukraine effort against Russia's invasion. Republican Lindsey Graham and Democrats Elizabeth Warren and Richard Blumenthal were caught up by an air raid alert and had to take cover in the parking lot from where they talked to the media. They later met Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. Ukrainian troops began their counteroffensive to regain lost territory in early June, but progress has been slow as they encountered vast Russian minefields and trenches, particularly in the southeast.
To the media reports saying this is a stalemate, you are wrong. They breached a major line of defense yesterday. There have been more Russian mines put in Ukraine maybe than any place in the history of modern warfare, and the Ukrainians have overcome, and if we stick with them, they will drive Russia out.
ATACMS are necessary. Long-range artillery is essential to reaching targets deeper in Soviet-occupied territory.
We're here to say, in a bipartisan way, we want to help them. We want to make sure they have the resources they need to be able to fight back against Vladimir Putin, because they are fighting for the survival of Ukraine, but they are also fighting for democracy everywhere else in the world. It is an honor to be able to stand with the Ukrainian people.
Can you justify the position of U.S.?
To the Brics summit in Johannesburg, here in Africa. In South Africa, Russian President Vladimir Putin has assured the group that Russia wants to end the war he claims was unleashed by the West and its satellites in Ukraine. Speaking by video link to leaders of the group who have refrained from condemning Moscow's actions in Ukraine, he repeated the Kremlin narrative that the war is a forced response to actions by Kyiv and the West. Russia has congratulated India on its successful lunar landing just days after Moscow's own attempt crashed on its way to the south pole of the moon. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov congratulated his Indian counterpart on the lunar achievement At an official bilateral meeting at the Brics summit taking place in the South African city of Johannesburg, Russian space agency Roscosmos said in a short statement that lunar exploration was important for the whole of mankind and that in the future it can become an important base for conquering deep space. The statement was accompanied by a waving animation of Russia's Luna 25 lunar lander, which crashed into the surface of the moon after spinning out of control on its descent to the South Polar lunar surface, which the Russian space agency confirmed on Sunday. Russia had been in a moon race against India and more broadly against China and the United States, which both have advanced lunar ambitions. And finally today, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke to members of the country's armed forces at a flag ceremony in Kiev yesterday as the country marked National Flag Day. President Zelensky said in his words, "Our flag is our strength, the source of will, and the unbreakable spirit for all." The ceremony was held on the eve of Ukraine's Independence Day. And that's where we leave it for today's special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Many thanks for watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Do have a good day.